Well, here we go again. It's probably been weeks since I talked about genocide? Maybe even a month? Well, I guess I should start 2020 with the type of content that you all crave for Step Back for some reason. So after the horrible genocide that happened in Germany and Poland in the 1940s, the Holocaust thing, we came together as a world, made some cool new world institutions, United Nations, UNCHR, things to try and prevent the exact same thing from happening all over again. However, that has never been a super successful venture. Ever since the Holocaust, there have been several genocides, several that I've talked about on this very channel, for example. And over and over and over again, the international community usually fails to step up and help or do the thing that needs to be done in order to prevent mass death. Given the way that now we are changing our language around refugees and that Islamophobia is becoming a normalized form of bigotry and hatred, it's all coming back. Happy 2020, Internet. So let's talk a little bit about the Rohingya people, who are a predominantly Muslim ethnic group that live in one state in Myanmar, which is a country that is between Bangladesh and Thailand. Last month, the International Criminal Court saw comments from Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Myanmar, and she tried to make the case that her people, the Burmese people, were not committing a genocide on the Rohingya, despite all the evidence that says that that's exactly what they were doing. So let's talk about another genocide and also criticize Islamophobia, because I know my comments are always just wonderful every time I do both of those. But seriously though, what's going on with the Rohingya people in Myanmar is extremely important to know. It's one of the most underreported important stories in our world right now, and the fact that the media coverage of it is so limited, especially in the Americas, is quite frankly disgusting. So first, we're going to need a little bit of context and history to talk about why there is this animosity towards the Rohingya people and Muslims in general, and how it all fits together. So in 1962, Burma, a former British colony, was taken over by a military junta that would then continue to reign until actually fairly recently. When you're trying to implement a right-wing dictatorship, the main thing you do to try and create cultural cohesion and build a nation is to go into a hyper-nationalist patriotism. In the case of Burma in 1962, the angle they decided to go for was to appeal to Burma having a long history of being Buddhist. Over 90% of Burma is Buddhist, and Myanmar today as well. And of course, if you want to construct an identity, if you want to make an us, you have to make a them. And so they did. They targeted the Rohingya people, who were predominantly Muslims. They would call the Rohingya people illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, even though the first roots of the Rohingya people showing up in Myanmar date all the way back to the 15th century. And they also show history going back to Arab traders, not Bangladesh. But of course, nationalism isn't about telling the truth, it's about telling the right story in order to create the right enemies. And to this day, the Rohingya people are still targeted for this purpose. And there have been several attempts to push the Rohingya people out of their ancestral territory and either make them disappear one way or another. So in 1978, there was something called Operation Dragon King, where 200,000 Rohingya people were forced out of the country to Bangladesh through use of violence and rape. But after the initial push out, the initial attempt at ethnic cleansing, about 170,000 of the Rohingya people returned to, their ancestral territory. The next step towards making the Rohingya a target for genocide was in 1982, Burma went through something called the Stateship Act, where they decided to give recognition to 132 different ethnic groups living within Myanmar or Burma, and give them citizenship based on those different ethnicities. The Rohingya were not amongst those recognized citizens, which essentially made them stateless people. And if there's one thing that you should learn when studying international history, especially in recent days, that stateless people are very, very vulnerable, because there's really no country backing them up. So a country can do pretty much whatever it wants, and the only backing they have is the UN, and the UN is fairly toothless. This also meant that the Rohingya people, being stateless, could not move freely. Even to go to other cities, they needed to get permission from the Burmese government in order to even go to another place to do something. In 1991, Burma went through another example of ethnic cleansing, this time under the really euphemistic name Operation Clean and Beautiful Nation, where 250,000 plus Rohingya people were pushed out of Myanmar. And on top of all of the state repression, there's of course lots of public repression going on as well. One case would be in 2002, where 4 Muslim men were accused of raping and murdering a Buddhist woman. This resulted in Buddhist nationalists coming together and going into Muslim neighborhoods and committing mass violence and destroying villages and destroying buildings and killing people. And even back then, Human Rights Watch was calling this ethnic cleansing. And so this is sort of the simmering stew that we get into when we get to 2016, where the Rohingya, who are actively living in a state where the government is trying to basically wipe them out of existence, and there's nowhere for them to go, started a militant group to fight back and fight for their own right to not die. So the militant group is called the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, and in 2016 they attacked some border guards and some police checkpoints, killed about 12 people. The security force response by the Myanmar government ended up killing over 400. And this led to a wave of terror and death and destruction that has to now displaced over 400,000 Rohingya people. Just to keep that in mind, there is about 1 million Rohingya people in total existence. Through this campaign of violence, murder, rape, mass sexual assault actually, and destruction, we've seen not through actual media outlets, because they've banned all media from going into the region, but they have confirmed through satellite photography burned down 210 Rohingya villages. And in an action that countries that totally did not commit genocide do, there's also been evidence shown through satellite photography that the Myanmar government is, after destroying these villages, burying the remains in order to cover up their crimes. There have been a few instances of finding mass graves that are being buried by the government and things like that. All of the things that governments do when they're trying to cover up the fact that they committed genocide. This campaign has involved arbitrary arrests, gang rapes, extrajudicial killings, general brutality against their own citizens, and looting. The Myanmar security forces have been reported to be using military helicopters to gun down civilians, firing machine guns on groups of civilians, especially those who are trying to escape across rivers. Escapees in Bangladesh of the Rohingya people have said that security forces have not only gang raped and murdered many of their people, but also have done horrible, brutal acts, burning down their houses, stealing their children and babies, and throwing them into the fire. There's also significant evidence that in violation of international treaties, Myanmar is planting landmines at the border with Bangladesh, so that those who have escaped have a much more dangerous time trying to return to their homes, and those that have not escaped are basically done for. And there's been mass suppression of anyone trying to report on this. 2 Reuters journalists were kept in prison for months because they tried to report on the violence that's going on to the Rohingya people. As you can imagine, this action has been universally criticized by many international NGOs in the United Nations. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN Human Rights Commission, all of them have pointed out that this is a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. In particular, Aung San Suu Kyi has been particularly criticized because she has made almost no mention publicly of the Rohingya people, and anytime she has spoken about the crisis going on in the country, she has more or less denied what's happening. As I mentioned, Aung San Suu Kyi was put in front of the International Criminal Court, where she defended what the police were doing, and said one of the weirder lines that it's not that bad because 50% of the Rohingya villages are still intact. As far as I remember, the other 50% are not. Now, trying to find numbers on how many people have been murdered in this ethnic cleansing, the closest estimates that we seem to be able to find are that at least 24,000 are dead. On top of that, 18,000 women and girls have been victims of rape and sexual assault. Just so you can put that in perspective, that's over 1 in 50 of the Rohingya people who are now dead. And almost 2% of the Rohingya people, that would be almost 4% of the Rohingya women, have been exposed to sexual assault because of this ethnic cleansing campaign. 116,000 Rohingya people, that's over 10%, have reported beatings, and 36,000 have reported being thrown into fires. Many of them children. By January of 2017, it's estimated that about 92,000 of the Rohingya people are now displaced in countries like Bangladesh and Thailand particularly. As of January of 2017, so it's probably even worse now, about 92,000 Rohingya people have been displaced because of this violence. And that number is likely much, much higher now. So I don't think that this needs much explanation as to why this is a horrific thing that everybody should be completely aghast and shocked at. And one of the things that has riled up nationalist Buddhists to hate their fellow humans comes from one extremely likely source. And this is one that, in all the talks about privacy and fake news and stuff like that, we don't really see the real human cost of. But Facebook had to admit that they played a role in facilitating the level of heat that led to this violence against the Rohingya people. There was a targeted campaign by the Myanmar military on Facebook to spread false stories demonizing Muslims and Rohingya people specifically in order to drum up more and more hatred from the Buddhist community against the Muslim community. And Facebook, when it expanded to Myanmar, had an extraordinarily limited amount of capability. People were able to post on Facebook in the language of Myanmar, Burmese, but to report a post for, say, demonizing Muslims and saying that they're a threat, all of that reporting site part was in English, a language most people in Myanmar do not know. That being said, they had in total for the entire country of Myanmar 14 employees who knew Burmese to monitor all of the content being put out in the country. So when radical monks and the Myanmar military are mass posting fake news stories trying to demonize Muslims and the Rohingya people, Facebook was completely inadequate at handling the task. And it's this widespread hatred that rises the temperature of hate against ethnic groups. And this has happened before. We saw this with radio stations in Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide. We've seen this around the world with the rise in hatred, especially against Muslims and Jews, leading to cases of different outbreaks of violence. You can learn more about this in a video done by American Johnson on the channel Non-Compete about stochastic terrorism and the Pewdie pipeline. It doesn't just function for white supremacists, it functioned for this case where Buddhists were being set to hate their Muslim minority. And that spills over into the modern crisis that we're in, because what's happening to Rohingya people is not the only case of Islamophobic genocide occurring right now, but on top of that, it's becoming more and more dangerous to be a Muslim in the world these days, with widespread Islamophobia. And a lot of those displaced Rohingya people as refugees, like in Bangladesh, where we have the world's largest refugee camp operating right now to house the Rohingya people, where Bangladesh was trying to make a deal with Myanmar to send Rohingya people back, where they would be right back in the freaking fire. And this is just one example of the mass growth of Islamophobia and the mass growth of hatred of refugees and all the protections put in place to protect religious diversity, to protect the rights of refugees because of what happened in the Holocaust. Those processes are starting to break down. And as climate change becomes more and more of an issue, there's going to be more and more refugees, climate refugees. There's going to be as many as 1 billion refugees by the end of the 21st century because large parts of the world are just going to become uninhabitable. And as the right no longer get as much juice out of denying that climate change is a thing, they're going to start moving towards eco-fascism, where they're going to start more focusing on trying to exclude immigrants from coming in and protecting mostly white supremacy from the hordes trying to just find a place to survive. I think it all comes together to say that Islamophobia kills. You might think that this is just, you protecting your frozen peaches or whatever the hell, but Islamophobia kills. Okay? We've seen this before. We've seen how anti-Semitism led to the Holocaust. And this is happening again. whether it be Muslims living in Myanmar, whether it be Muslims living in China. We're going to get to that in a future video. This is getting worse. We saw this last year in Christchurch. We saw it in my country of Canada with a mass shooting at a mosque in Quebec City. This is a problem that's getting worse, and we need to address it. We need a society that's based on pluralism and love, because when we don't have a society based on these principles, that's when we have mass death and genocide. Multiculturalism and religious tolerance are not just flowery terms for a society we like. This is how we prevent lots and lots of people from dying. If you want to help out in some fashion, though, you can donate to UNHCR. There's going to be a link in the description. It's the UN Organization for Refugee Rights, and they need help trying to find homes and to protect and fund these refugee camps and to find places for Rohingya people to live where they're not in threat of being wiped off the face of the planet. Also, I know for a fact that my analytics say that at least 42 views in my channel have come from Myanmar. Please, if you're watching this from Myanmar, I entreat you to please embrace your sisters, brothers, and non-binary siblings, because we're all stuck on this little pebble together. I want you all to realize that hate is a dark and corrupting force in our world, and one that we should oppose at all places. Well, that got intense. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about genocide, you could watch my other video on the Rwandan genocide. And if you want to get more of me, you can watch the many streams I do at twitch.tv/stepbackhistory. And lastly, of course, this video would not be possible if it wasn't for my amazing patrons. If you want to see videos early and help make content like this possible for as little as $1 a month, it really helps if you go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and make any pledge that you feel that you can do. Please don't break the bank, though. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next time for more Step Back. Had no citizenship, which means that they couldn't leave the country. Thebes, no, thank you.